Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Anne-Marie Barker-Schwartz and I'm the director and violinist of Musicians of Malwick. And today we have Max Kaplan, who's a regular feature here at the church and with Musicians of Malwick, and he'll be playing piano all today. And then we have Tess McCarthy, who's our mezzo-soprano, and will be singing several different types of songs and arias today, some from the early 1900s and some quite contemporary. Today's program is actually part of a program that's being broadcast by the Albany Public Library, and we welcome our viewers today. So today's concept or sort of idea behind this program is a celebration of women's suffrage musically. And of course, 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the passing or the passing of the 19th Amendment, which was ratified or passed, actually, voted in on August 18th, 1920. So we're 100 years out from the passing of the 19th Amendment. Today's music features works of both American and British composers because the suffrage movement was going on simultaneously in Great Britain and in many ways helped inform the ways that American women sort of motivated and activated their suffrage ideas and missions. So we're going to begin today with a suffrage hymn. It was written in the early 1900s, actually by a man, but the lyrics were by a woman. And we'll begin with that now.
Oh
So we opened with a suffrage hymn, which was written by Carl Birch in 1917, and I think you can imagine what it would feel like to be sitting around a group of women, and maybe a few men, discussing suffrage and starting your meetings with a rousing hymn like that. Today's program features both that kind of music that's sort of more homegrown, as well as some compositions that are extremely sophisticated by women composers who were just coming into their own during the suffrage period. We turn now to music that is in the Library of Congress American Memory Collection. If you've ever visited that collection, which is on their website, you'll see that there's a tremendous amount of sheet music that's cataloged according to both its dates and its topics. And there's a large category of suffrage music. The next song is a different kind of hymn. It's called Votes for Women, the International Hymn of the Suffragettes. And it was written in 1930 by W.H. Charlton.
Gone is not
So that was the international hymn of the Suffragettes called Votes for Women. And once again, I think you can hear in that kind of music a real rallying cry with sort of instructions to its listeners and singers. We turn now to much more high art music with a work by Marion Bauer. Marion is, or was, an American composer, and she was born in 1882, lived until 1955. She never received an official degree in music, but she was absolutely brilliant and capable in a number of different arenas in her musical life. She worked as a reviewer in Chicago. She had her own radio program during the 1930s and 1940s. She was the first female composer to teach at New York University, and also later she got a faculty position at Juilliard. She was a close friend of Aaron Copland and was invited by Copland to be the first woman on the ASCAP board, which was quite a feat for a woman at the time. One of her students was Milton Babbitt. She was a very influential composer and very much involved in the fabric of American music life. And it's kind of hard to believe that just about 70 years after her death, she's so completely forgotten today. One of her associates who was very fond of her music was the great American female violinist Maude Powell. Maude Powell was probably the greatest living American soloist during her lifetime. She was responsible for premiering here in America the Bruch Violin Concerto, the Dvorak Concerto, the Sibelius Concerto, the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, all given by Maude Powell here in America as their premieres. Just a really fabulous violin player, very, very well respected. One of her goals as a musician was to encourage the sort of promotion and publication, composition of works by American composers. And she met Marion Bauer fairly early on in her career, and in 1911, Maude Powell wrote a poem about a boat trip up a river in Florida, which was called the Ocklawaha River. And she sent this to Marion Bauer, who was so inspired by the poem that she wrote a wonderful, what she called, tone picture depicting this poem musically. This was first performed in the spring of 1912 to great reviews, and Maude Powell often performed it on her recitals until her death in the early 1920s. So here's the tone poem, Opus 6, titled Up the Ocklawaha by Marion Bauer. So that was music by Marion Bauer, a really very gifted, as I hope you heard, composer, the first female composer to teach at New York University, but also the teacher of Milton Babbitt, among others. That was a tone poem called Up the Ocklawaha, describing a boat journey up this river in sort of very primitive conditions, and I think it does a wonderful job of depicting that scene. So our next work is also by Marion Bauer, and we have one member of the group today who has not yet played, who is our wonderful flutist, Norman Thibodeau. And Norman will be playing a set of works by Marion Bauer that actually have never been published. They're sitting in a stack at the Library of Congress, and they're very interesting pieces. You'll hear once again what a fabulous composer she is and what a unique voice she has sort of compositionally. They were written in 1936, and I'll introduce Norm and let him speak a little bit about them.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. As was mentioned, Marion Bauer.
Norm, you have to talk into the mic.
I know. Easing into it. Now we'll get into the real nitty-gritty information. Marion Bauer was active pedagogically, as was noted, and as you might expect, well, from any 20th century composer, but certainly one who taught theory, she investigated a lot of different ways of organizing tones, including, I have not heard the pieces yet, but I have it to understand microtones. But for this piece, she actually reached back to the modes, and not even the church modes. She reached way back to the ancient Greek modes. And so this piece is called Forgotten Modes, and in acknowledgement of the Greek theoretical source, it's also been called Five Greek Lyrics. And either it was from not being published, and it was a forgotten piece as well as forgotten modes, or maybe she liked the number 29 a lot because it's opus 29, but then another piece for completely different instrumentation is also opus 29 somewhere among her publications. So this I'm going to be playing off a facsimile of a hand manuscript, and so it's essentially my own editing. Each of the movements, the 5 movements, is based on a different Greek mode. And let's see what's coming. Dorian chromatic is the first movement. Then Mixolydian, that's a shorter down-tempo kind of insouciant piece. Then a rather active one on the Phrygian chromatic mode. And the 4th movement is the one adagio in the piece, Oriental chromatic, with, if I'm reading this and interpreting correctly, electro rhythm. And then the last one is quite cheerful, short, and based on Phrygian mode, but ancient Greek Phrygian mode, which sounds very different than medieval Phrygian mode. Sure.
So what I think you can hear in the, 1912 to 1936, in those intervening years, a dramatic change in her style. So those were 5 modes, forgotten modes, of Marion Bauer, Opus 29, one of 2 Opus 29s, played by Norman Thibodeau. We turn now to British chamber music, written by Ethel Smythe. Ethel was the first female composer in British to become a Dame of the British Empire, and she was also the first female composer to be performed at the Metropolitan Opera. Her opera, The Forest, was performed there in 1904. The next time a female composer would be featured at the Met would not be until 2007. Pretty staggering. So, we turn now to a wonderful trio that she wrote in 1927, and I actually picked this work because it's the year before the British fully voted in women's suffrage. So they were actually behind us, even though the movement started to gain steam a little bit earlier. It took them a little bit longer to get around to passing it. This particular work, which is based on an old Shakespearean tune, Bonnie Sweet Robin, which is sung by Ophelia in his play Hamlet, first sort of got into the public mention in 1586 when Sir Walter Raleigh mentioned to the Earl of Leicester that the Queen of England had forgiven him and he was back to being her sweet Robin. It's remained sort of in this early music form. Ethel Smythe took the work and wrote a set of variations. It can be performed by either flute, oboe, and piano, or flute, violin, and piano. You'll hear the presentation of the melody right away, and then from there it kind of transforms into quite a complicated set of variations that, unlike classical variations that kind of stop and start, these variations dovetail from one to another and show you really her great skill as a composer. That was Bonnie's Sweet Robin variations of Ethel Smythe. And I should mention, by the way, that she trained formally in Leipzig and was well acquainted with Clara Schumann and Johannes Brahms and Tchaikovsky and Dvorak and really all the great composers and artists of the day. And she made her, most of her time was spent living in England when she finished her training, but it came from a really wonderful musical pedigree. We'll hear more about her in a few moments. We turn now to music back sort of on the lighter side. From this repository at the Library of Congress, from this collection of suffrage songs, a song that's really almost a foxtrot called She's Good Enough to Be Your Baby's Mother, and She's Good Enough to Vote With You. And there was a popular sentiment at the time that women were not capable of both being mothers and voting, that somehow these two activities were in conflict. Hopefully that's not the case. But at the time, you'll see a lot of cartoons portraying mothers that are going out and rallying for the suffrage movement as abandoning their families. And so this song is one of those sort of against those types of sentiments. It was written in 1916 by Herman Paley. So she's good enough to be your baby's mother. She's good enough to vote with you.
No man is greater than his mother. No man is half so good. No man is better than the wife he loves. Her love will guide him, whatever betide him. She's good enough to love you and adore you. She's good enough to bear your troubles for you. And if your tears were falling today, nobody else would kiss them away. She's good enough to warm your heart with kisses when you are lonesome and blue. She's good enough to be your baby's mother, and she's good enough to vote with you. Man plunged the world in war and sadness. She must protest in vain. Let's hope and pray someday we'll hear her say, stop all your madness, I bring you gladness. She's good enough to love you and adore you. She's good enough to bear your troubles for you. And if your tears were falling today, nobody else would kiss them away. She's good enough to warm your heart with kisses when you are lonesome and blue. She's good enough to be your baby's mother, and she's good enough to vote with you.
So a lovely song with interesting sentiments. You probably heard the title, but She's Good Enough to Be Your Baby's Mother, and She's Good Enough to Vote With You, written in 1916 by Herman Paley. We turn now to the one set of contemporary pieces on the program, written by the young man sitting at the piano, Max Kaplan. In 2016, I read a wonderful story about a woman, Lita Richburg Hornsby, who had attempted a flyover of the New York harbor with the plan to bombard Woodrow Wilson's presidential yacht, the Mayflower, with Votes for Women pamphlets. And they took off on a cold December evening in 1916. And unfortunately, there were gale force winds, and Lita and her companion crashed fairly shortly after taking off. They fortunately were okay. They kind of walked out of it with just bumps and bruises. But it was really an amazing feat of bravery and a demonstration of their conviction to the women's suffrage movement. And so I read that story and I was extremely inspired by it, and I thought, wow, wouldn't this make a great opera? Around the same time, Musicians of Maude was playing on a Union College chamber music recording session with Hilary Tan, who was the head of the composition program there. And one of her students, Max Kaplan, was giving sort of his senior recital, and we played on it, and I was just really overwhelmed with his talent and creativity and his musicianship. And already at that point in his development, his own sort of unique voice as a composer. And I kept thinking about this idea of an opera and Max, and I finally decided to talk to Max, and he literally ran with the project, writing not only the music, but the libretto as well. And we premiered it in June of 2018. It was a great success, wonderful reviews, good audience response, and it's really very special and exciting experience, I think, for us all. So we thought we would include 2 excerpts from this opera today, and who better to tell you a little bit about the opera than the composer himself?
So the main character of the opera is, as Anne-Marie sort of implied, Lita Rickberg Hornsby, who is portrayed by Tess. We're going to be doing 2 excerpts, both of which are sung by this character. Of the 2 years that I spent working on the opera, probably the first 6 months were spent combing through all the online databases of old newspaper articles that I could find to try to get a sense of Lita's character. A little bit about her: she was the 8th woman to receive a pilot's license in the United States, and the first woman to graduate from the famous Wright Brothers Flying School, where she was actually a pupil of Orville Wright for a while. She was also arrested at one point in 1917 for participating in a protest outside the White House. So the first excerpt we're going to do is her opening aria, which establishes her love of aviation. And the second excerpt occurs at a pivotal moment when she accepts the mission to fly over the Statue of Liberty to bomb President Wilson with petitions. And that excerpt features a direct quote, which is, "This is war for women's rights. I am proud to fly for you."
Berlin, as you first leave the earth, the quickening of your pulse, the tensing of your muscles, and that glorious exhilaration as you pierce the heavens, and every tingling nerve cries out, "You're alive!" What a wonderful thing is flying, to reflect, to contemplate things infinite, unfathomable. In flying you lose yourself, in the air you're free, and all your troubles seem as far away as the trees and houses far below. I must confess the scheme appeals to me, to fly in a cause, and one as worthy as that for which the men are dying in Europe. No, the same cause, that of liberty. This is war. This is war for women's rights. I am proud to fly for you. Proud to fly for you. Let the men fight another country's battle overseas. We'll fight the tyranny at home. The tyranny. We'll fight the tyranny. The tyranny. The tyranny at home. I must confess the scheme appeals to me, to fly in a cause. Liberty, yes, the cause of liberty. The women voters of the West, enfranchised ladies of the United States, to urgently request as fundamental democratic rights, equality, political freedom. Yes, liberty for women, liberty for women across the USA. The women of the West speak for all of womankind. We want our freedom. We want our rights. We want our rights. We want our rights.
So you just heard two marvelous excerpts from Max Kaplan's opera Alida, or The Flight of the Suffrage Women, which was written from about 2016 to 2018 and premiered almost exactly 2 years ago, last weekend. So hard to believe that much time has gone by. Tess was the lead in it, and Norman played in the opera orchestra as well. It was really a very special experience. So we've come to our final piece for this program. We're returning to music of Ethel Smythe. As I mentioned, she was a very well-trained composer. She was also a very passionate advocate for women's suffrage. She was a close friend of Emmeline Pankhurst, who was the British female leader of the suffrage movement. And in I want to make sure I get the date right here, 1910, she wrote a new hymn for women that would replace the old hymn. And there's kind of an interesting story along with this hymn, which is that Smythe became passionate enough about the cause that she actually quit composing for 2 years and became involved with some of the activism, including being arrested during that time and spending 2 months in a terrible jail, Holloway Prison, in London. And the great conductor, Sir Thomas Beecham, probably wasn't a Sir then at that time, but anyway, he came to visit her and found her there actually conducting the suffrage march with a toothbrush out her window. So I think it says something about her peppy spirit. Anyway, you'll hear, I think, a tremendous difference between this women's hymn and the first one we played, which was much more sort of Victorian parlor music. This is actually a fairly sophisticated piece of music with, I'd say, much more sort of classical, high art kind of harmonization than the first one. So here now we conclude today with the British March of the Women by Ethel Smythe.
Shout, shout, up with your song, cry with the wind, for the dawn is breaking. March, march, swing you along, wide
The final piece was March of the Women, the sort of national British women's suffrage hymn written in 1910 by Ethel Smythe. Thank you very much for joining us today. Once again, our performers, and I'll do it this way: Max Kaplan, pianist and composer; Tess McCarthy, a mezzo-soprano, and she was, of course, the lead in Alita; Norman Thibodeau, flute, who also wrote the wonderful obligato that quoted Rule Britannia in the final piece; and I'm Anne-Marie Barker-Schwartz, director and violinist for Musicians of Malwick.